Okay. I'm Jerry Easter, the chair of political science, and I will wrap up this affair by discussing democratic resilience in Eastern Europe. All right. I'll point out by saying that despite the title, I did understand this to mean liberal democratic resilience. And so my remarks will reflect that interpretation. 1989, of course, is the year that the communism falls in Eastern Europe and begins the process by which Eastern Europe can finally join liberal democratic Western Europe. On May Day in 2004, 8 countries from Eastern Europe were part of the large enlargement of the EU. And it was celebrated on that day across Eastern Europe, but in particular in a small town in the southeast corner of Saxony, in East Germany, at the town of Zittau, where on one road leads to Poland and another road out of the town center leads to the Czech Republic. And on that day, the German Chancellor Schröder, along with the Polish Prime Minister Miller and the Czech Prime Minister Spiedler, was his name, all gathered to raise the EU flag to open up the border in a symbolic gesture to the liberal triumph in Eastern Europe. The liberal triumph after maybe going back to the battles of the French Revolution, of course, yeah? And now liberal Europe had become a reality. There was great optimism at that time. It was a tremendous effort that the EU attempted to incorporate 125 million people, more than 24 countries, into this project. It was very generous and exceedingly ambitious. On this day as well, as part of these ceremonies, there was another fellow there who is German, and he had the job of had a job with the EU for the integration of the East. His name was Verhoeven, and he remarked on that day that I can't see. Okay, we've finally reached the point in European history where borders do not matter anymore. So it just captures the mood of mid-2000s Eastern Europe. It's not too long after that, I would point to the year 2008, that the liberal project in Eastern Europe began to stall. And it, I would say, remains stalled since that time. And what came in the wake of 2008, which is notable for the financial crisis, but it's also notable for the point at which NATO began to move further east into Eastern Europe and wanted to bring Ukraine and Georgia into the military alliance as well. That this geopolitical imperative was intensified in the region. What has come in the wake is what I would call the post-liberal reckoning in Eastern Europe. The post-liberal reckoning is a reaction to the liberalizing, the liberalizing revolution that comes in with 1989, the neoliberal economic policies of 1989, and it manifests itself in socioeconomic, in social cultural, and in political ways. So I'll just sketch those manifestations, and then I'll wrap up by commenting on how well has commenting on democratic resilience in the wake of post-liberalism in Eastern Europe. So socioeconomic things that I think everyone is probably very familiar with, that's driven by the globalization. Eastern Europe will be hit with similar things that happen in Western Europe and are happening in America, like deindustrialization, but they're hit with them more suddenly, and the effects of them are wider and deeper. The economic transformation will lead to an uneven economic development. There'll be some richer regions, urban regions, and some new industrial places are reinvigorated industries from Western manufacturers moving east. But it will also contain very poor regions. The poorest regions in Europe will be found in the east, and in particularly in the southeast. And what doesn't get, in my opinion, nearly as much attention as it should is the social ill effects of that economic revolution in Eastern Europe that impacted health. It impacted mental health, it impacted identity, it impacted population vitality. So that's one element of that's related to the post-liberal turn. The second is social cultural. Eastern Europe remains a bulwark of traditional conservatism. There's a resistance in Eastern Europe to what's seen to Western style consumption and lifestyles that in Eastern Europe are either out of reach or just simply seem to be out of sorts. There's a perception of individualism run amok. Exists in wide quarters of East European populations. And was resistance to the programs of social progress, that gender, et cetera, that the liberalizing revolution brought. Another element that's social cultural, I'm good, is of course nationalism. So there's a Berkeley historian, John Connolly of Eastern Europe, he's a good historian, and he devised a concept to describe the nationalisms in Eastern Europe. And he calls it a crisis frame of reference. These are small nations that have, for a long time, felt very vulnerable about their survival. They see themselves as victims, they see themselves as martyrs, and they see themselves as desperate. They don't necessarily believe that their nation will survive. And with the socio-cultural revolution, this nationalism was reignited in the later 2000s and in the 2000 teens in the region. This crisis frame of reference, and it comes from competing directions. It comes from the West. It comes from Brussels. It comes from Brussels' policies of seeming to infringe on sovereignty of nations that, after so long being under the heavy hand of Soviet communism, are finally free, but now we're not free because we're part of Brussels, and they're trying to micromanage how we want to order our affairs. And that's exacerbated by the immigration refugee crisis, which is also seen to be Brussels related. And then, of course, by the mid-2000 teens comes the resurgent threat of an aggressive Russia pushing westward into and interfering in Ukraine, and bringing a threat over the region again. But that's the social cultural. Those manifest themselves in the region's post-liberal politics. The post-liberal politics witnessed the upending of what had been the traditional kind of left-right division of politics associated with 20th century democracy, and the the social cleavages that aligned accordingly. Eastern Europe now is rend, I think that's a verb, is rendered by a cleavage between kind of savvy cosmopolitans, these people with high-tech skills, high-end consumption, people who attach themselves to liberal Europe. And the other side is neo-traditionalists, people who have embraced a religious revival. The region also, that's social cultural as well too, I guess, is the higher identity with religion and the greater influence of the church in affairs, in politics. And also a very proud chauvinism, an ethno-national chauvinism. And these political systems are roughly polarized in a very similar and familiar way to what we know now in the West. The polarization has led to two kinds of elites. There's those attached to liberal Europe, which are seen to be kind of horizontal elites. They're connected to people like them in other countries and to Brussels. They take their cues from Brussels technocrats and Davos influences. They speak English. And in Eastern Europe, their speaking English is not it's not unlike the way in which old regime Europe spoke French, even if they weren't in France, but spoke French to each other. They were horizontal elites, not attached to the people in society. Post-liberal elites tend to have these vertical connections. They connect to local business, not the multinationals, not Volkswagen, but to local businesses and to local cultural elites, church people often. And they explicitly, in their political rhetoric, defend the nation. They see the nation under threat. They see the nation being diluted culturally, population-wise, and they speak out against that. Let me see. they're explicitly antagonistic to the liberal elites and try to depict them as being not as being disconnected from the nation, the people. They are very hostile to anything multicultural, anything in terms of aesthetics, gender, etc. So that's a characterization of where politics has gone in this post-liberal reckoning. So the very last thing I'll do now is talk about how has Eastern Europe stood, democracy in Eastern Europe. In the 1990s, throughout almost all the region, there were reforms that created democratic constitutions, multi-party systems, civil rights, competitive electoral systems. How have those democratic systems stood up to the threat of post-liberalism and post-liberal elites? And it's a mixed record. But it's not probably as bleak as one would think. So Viktor Orban is often put forward as the poster child of what's gone wrong in Eastern Europe. And Hungary is a case that indeed democracy has not stood up so well to post-liberalism. But for a while, Poland was even ahead of Hungary on that category. But Polish democratic institutions have managed to work and vote a post-liberal political party out of power. But you see it in places as well where post-liberal elites run and win election to the parliament, become prime ministers, or become presidents in Slovenia, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in Croatia. So there are places where the democracy has been able to work in this environment. The places where it has been less successful is the places where when the EU stopped trying to bring in the rest of Eastern Europe into the EU, the parts of the former Yugoslavia and the Western Balkans. Those are places where the politics is much more likely, where democratic institutions have been corrupted and subverted by post-liberal politicians. Within the and the second factor that would explain the variation, I think, is places where the political left collapsed are places where post-liberal elites did well, and where the resilience of their fragile democracies fared poorly. All right, and that's all I got to say.